I am Joshua, 31, and I flew 3,000 miles for my parents' 40th anniversary with a small gift wrapped in thick gold paper. But before I could even pull out a chair at their reserved table, my mother looked dead at me, her face ice cold, and announced, "We didn't invite you. Your brother planned this." Then my father didn't even look me in the eye. He just reached out, casually pushed my gift right off the edge of the table, and muttered, "We don't want any cheap thing from you." The box hit the hardwood floor with a heavy thud. The entire dining room went dead silent. Before I tell you about the shocking truth of what was actually inside that box, and the absolute panic that hit them when they finally realized what they threw away, do me a quick favor. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. Grab a warm glass of water, sit down, and listen to me tell the whole story. I didn't yell. I didn't cause a massive scene. I calmly bent down, picked up the golden box, and walked right out the restaurant door. But to understand why that exact moment broke me, and why that specific box was the ultimate test for my family, you have to know how we got to that table in the first place. It didn't start with an anniversary dinner. It started years ago when I first realized I wasn't a son to them. I was just a bank account. The flight from Denver, Colorado to Columbus, Ohio took exactly 3 hours and 12 minutes. I know this because I spent every single minute of it staring at the gold-wrapped box sitting rigidly on my lap. I didn't read. I didn't sleep. I just traced the sharp, folded edges of the wrapping paper with my thumb, feeling the heavy weight of the documents hidden inside. When the plane finally touched down, my stomach tied itself into a familiar, painful knot. I walked through the terminal, bypassed baggage claim since I only brought a carry-on, and went straight to the rental car counter. They handed me the keys to a small, unassuming gray sedan. As I pulled out of the airport lot and merged onto Interstate 70 heading east, the landscape quickly shifted. The towering, jagged peaks of the Rockies that I had grown used to in Denver were replaced by the flat, endless green expanses of Ohio. I drove for an hour and a half, the highway eventually narrowing down into 2-lane country roads. Every mile marker, every grain silo, every weathered billboard felt like a ghost from a past I had tried desperately to outrun. I passed the old gas station on Route 31 that had been claiming it was closing soon, since I was in middle school. I passed the hardware store where my dad used to buy his tools. And then, at exactly 4:15 in the afternoon, I turned onto Maple Drive in the town of Hardin. Population, barely 4,000. There it was, the house. It looked exactly the same. The same faded brown siding that always needed a fresh coat of paint but never got one. The same sagging chain-link fence separating our yard from Mrs. Patterson's property. The same cracked concrete driveway where I used to scrape my knees as a kid. But today the house was dressed up. Bright silver and gold balloons were tightly tied to the rusted mailbox. A massive, professionally printed banner hung all the way across the front porch railing. It read, in bold black letters, "Happy 40th Anniversary, Robert and Eleanor." The street was absolutely packed. Cars lined both sides of the road for a solid block. I recognized Uncle Ray's beat-up Ford pickup truck. I saw my cousin Bobby's red Jeep. I counted at least 20 vehicles, meaning there had to be 50 or 60 people crammed inside that modest living room. I parked at the very end of the block, killed the engine, and just sat there in the sudden silence of the car. My hands were gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were completely white. I forced myself to let go. I rolled down the window just a crack. The crisp October wind carried the distinct sound of loud, layered conversation and a muffled country music song playing through the walls of the house. It was the sound of a family celebration. A family I supposedly belonged to. 60 people inside, laughing, eating, drinking, and not a single one of them was expecting me to walk through that door. I looked down at the gold box on the passenger seat. The corner of the wrapping paper had slightly creased during the turbulence on the flight. I carefully smoothed it out with my index finger. Doubt, cold and heavy, started creeping up my throat. What if I walk in there and nothing changes? What if this entire trip is just me walking straight into another firing squad? I sat in that car for 10 solid minutes, watching the afternoon sunlight filter through the dying autumn leaves. I took one long, deep breath, holding it in my lungs until they burned. Then, I grabbed the box, opened the car door, and stepped out onto the pavement. The walk from my car to the front porch was maybe 30 yards. It felt like walking to my own execution. I climbed the 3 wooden steps to the porch. I could smell Aunt Sarah's famous baked ziti radiating through the screen door. I grabbed the handle. It gave that same high-pitched squeak it always had. I pulled it open and stepped over the threshold into the entryway. The living room was unrecognizable. All the furniture had been shoved out of the way to make room for rented folding tables pushed together in a massive L shape. The tables were covered in pristine white linens. Folding chairs borrowed from the local community center lined every inch of the walls. There were expensive floral centerpieces on the tables. This was clearly my older brother Elijah's doing. He never missed a chance to flash money around to look like a big shot. In the corner, a large flat-screen TV was playing a photo slideshow on a loop. Pictures of Mom and Dad at their wedding, pictures of them on vacations, pictures of them holding Elijah as a baby, Elijah graduating, Elijah holding up a fish. I watched it for a full minute. I wasn't in a single photograph. A few heads turned toward the entryway. Mrs. Patterson, the neighborhood gossip who knew everything about everyone's divorce, custody battles, and bank accounts, was standing near the coat rack. She paused mid-bite of a dinner roll, her eyes going wide. "Joshua?" she said. She didn't whisper it. She said it loud enough that the sound cut through the music. The reaction was instantaneous. The hum of conversation died a sudden, unnatural death. Forks clattered onto paper plates. 60 pairs of eyes snapped away from their conversations and locked onto me. Then those eyes drifted down to the gold box resting in my hands, and slowly back up to my face. The silence was thick, suffocating, and incredibly awkward. I scanned the sea of faces. I saw Uncle Ray standing by the drink cooler, his jaw slack. I saw Cousin Bobby leaning against the wall, crossing his arms protectively. Then I found her. Aunt Sarah, my mother's younger sister. She was standing right near the arched doorway leading to the kitchen, holding a plastic cup of iced tea. The moment she saw me, she froze. Her eyes darted to the gold box, and a fierce, knowing light sparked in her eyes. She knew exactly what I was carrying. We had kept this massive secret for 5 years, and in that one brief look across a crowded, silent room, we silently communicated everything. I gave her a microscopic nod. She pressed her lips into a thin line and nodded back. From the head of the long table, the crowd parted slightly. Elijah stepped forward. He had been holding a glass of champagne, right in the middle of giving a toast. He was dressed in a sharp, clearly expensive navy suit. The moment he laid eyes on me, his charismatic smile vanished, replaced by a tight, panicked grimace. He quickly plastered the smile back on, but it didn't reach his eyes. He set his champagne glass down and marched toward me. He didn't offer a hug. He didn't offer a handshake. He stopped inches from my face and hissed under his breath, "What the hell are you doing here? I specifically told you Dad didn't want you here." I didn't blink. I didn't lower my voice to match his. I spoke clearly and evenly. "I came to give Mom and Dad their anniversary gift." Elijah scoffed, his eyes darting to the box. "What is that? Some cheap last-minute garbage you picked up at the airport gift shop? You need to leave before you ruin their night." I ignored him. I physically stepped around him, forcing him to move back, and looked toward the head of the table. My father, Robert, had turned his chair around. He was wearing his stiff, pressed Sunday shirt, his arms crossed over his chest like a barricade. Beside him sat my mother, Eleanor. Her hands were resting on the table, nervously shredding a paper napkin into tiny pieces. I walked straight toward them. The crowd parted for me like the Red Sea, nobody saying a single word. When I reached the table, I stopped. Mom looked up at me. For a fraction of a second, I saw something in her eyes. Maybe shock, maybe a flicker of maternal recognition. But it was instantly swallowed by fear as she glanced sideways at my father. "Joshua," Mom said. Her voice was small, trembling slightly, but in that silent room, it echoed. We didn't invite you. Your brother planned all of this. The words hit me like a physical blow to the chest. 60 people heard my own mother say that to me. I felt the heat rise in my face, but I kept my posture completely straight. I know, I said, my voice remarkably steady. But I came anyway, because it's your 40th anniversary, and I have something for you and Dad. I stepped forward and gently placed the gold box on the white tablecloth, right in the center, between a vase of lilies and their massive anniversary cake. The overhead lights caught the gold foil. Dad stared at the box. He didn't look at me. He just stared at the shiny paper. The muscles in his jaw flexed and bunched. A vein throbbed on his temple. Without a word of greeting, without a single question about how I was doing, he reached out his thick, calloused right hand. He didn't just push the box. He swatted it. His palm slammed into the side of the box, sending it skidding violently across the table. It flew off the edge and hit the hardwood floor with a loud, heavy thud. One corner of the beautiful gold wrapping paper tore open, exposing the plain brown cardboard underneath. Several people in the room gasped out loud. Aunt Sarah took a step forward but stopped herself. We don't want any cheap thing from you, Dad bellowed. His voice was a thunderclap. He wanted everyone in the room to hear him. He pointed a finger at Elijah, who was standing behind me looking incredibly smug. Your brother paid for this party. Your brother paid for this house. He showed up. You abandoned us. I stood perfectly still. I looked at the torn box on the floor. I looked at my father's furious, red face. I looked at my mother, who had her eyes squeezed shut, refusing to intervene. And then I looked at Elijah, who was wearing the expression of a man who had won the lottery. I slowly bent down. I picked up the box. I took my thumb and carefully smoothed the torn flap of gold paper back into place, taking my time, letting the deafening silence of the room stretch out. I stood back up and looked my father dead in the eye. I didn't come here to beg for your attention, I said, my voice carrying to every corner of the room. I came to give you something I spent the last 5 years of my life working for. But I will not stand here and be humiliated by you for loving you. I didn't wait for a response. I turned on my heel and walked back through the crowd. No one moved to stop me. No one said a word. As I reached the entryway, Aunt Sarah stepped out from the kitchen. She reached out and grabbed my forearm. Her grip was iron. Leave it with me, Joshua, she whispered fiercely, her eyes blazing with an intense, protective fury. Trust me. I hesitated for a second. Then I handed her the gold box. I pushed open the screen door, walked down the porch steps, got into my rental car, and drove away. As I merged back onto the highway, I knew the timer had started. To understand why that box was about to tear my family's reality apart, I have to take you back 5 years, to the day I realized I was entirely invisible. Growing up in Hardin, Ohio, my brother Elijah was the golden child, and I was the shadow. It wasn't just a slight preference. It was a fundamental law of physics in our household. Elijah was loud, athletic, and possessed a silver tongue that could talk him out of any trouble. I was quiet, observant, and spent my time drawing blueprints and building intricate models out of balsa wood in my bedroom. I remember a specific Tuesday evening when I was 14. I had just won first place in a statewide architectural drafting competition for high schoolers. I was incredibly proud. I brought the blue ribbon and the certificate to the dinner table, placing them carefully next to my plate. Dad walked in from his plumbing job, covered in dirt and grease. He walked right past my certificate, went straight to Elijah, and clapped him on the shoulder. Elijah had just made the junior varsity baseball team as a backup catcher. We spent the entire dinner talking about Elijah's batting average. My blue ribbon got pushed aside by a bowl of mashed potatoes and eventually stained with gravy. Dad had a terrible joke he loved to tell whenever we had company over. He'd stand by the grill, point his spatula at Elijah, and say, "Elijah got the brains and the brawn." Then he'd point at me, chuckle and say, "And Joshua, well, Joshua is Joshua." Everyone would laugh. I learned to force a smile and laugh along, because getting angry only made me look jealous. When I turned 26, I got an incredible job offer. A mid-sized architectural firm in Denver, Colorado offered me a junior associate position. It came with a decent starting salary and the promise of a real career. I packed my entire life into the trunk of my beat-up Honda Civic. The morning I left, the house was eerily quiet. I found Dad in the kitchen, lying on his back under the sink, wrenching a pipe. I stood in the doorway with my duffel bag over my shoulder. "Dad," I said, "I'm heading out, driving to Denver today." He didn't slide out from under the cabinets. He didn't put down his wrench. He just grunted from the shadows. "Good. One less mouth to feed around here." I stood there for 5 seconds, waiting for a "drive safe" or an "I love you." Nothing came. I walked out the door, got into my car, and drove out of Ohio with a lump in my throat, so large I could barely swallow. Denver was a completely different world. The altitude was rough, the rent was high, and I didn't know a single soul. But I threw myself into my work. I stayed late, I came in on weekends, and I slowly started building a life. And then I met Chloe. Chloe was a graphic designer who worked in the building across the street. We bumped into each other at a coffee shop, and she accidentally spilled half an iced latte on my blueprints. She was mortified. I was captivated. Chloe was the first person in my entire life who looked at me and didn't immediately look for someone better standing behind me. She saw me for exactly who I was, and she loved me for it. Even though I was building a new life, I still desperately tried to hold onto the old one. For the first 2 years in Denver, I called my parents' house every single Sunday at 7 p.m. Mom would answer maybe once a month. She'd give me brief, hurried updates about the weather or the neighbors. Dad never got on the phone. "He's busy in the garage," Mom would always say. I tried texting Elijah. "Hey man, how are things back home?" I'd write. Days later, he'd reply, "Busy. You know how Dad is. Still mad you abandoned the family for a fancy city job. Don't take it personally." I refused to give up. I spent 3 weeks meticulously hand-carving a beautiful mahogany clock for Dad's birthday. I sanded it, stained it, and shipped it via priority mail. I tracked the package. It arrived on a Tuesday. Wednesday came, no call. Thursday, nothing. Finally, I called Elijah and asked if Dad liked the clock. Elijah sighed heavily into the phone, sounding exhausted by my mere existence. "Listen, Joshua, I don't know how to tell you this. They threw it away. Dad didn't even want to open the box. I'm sorry, man. That broke me. I stopped calling every Sunday. I stopped sending gifts. I focused entirely on Chloe and my career, eventually earning a major promotion to senior architect. I was making a great salary, Chloe and I were talking about marriage, and we had even started putting money away into a high-yield savings account, the beginning of a future college fund for the kids we eventually wanted to have. I was happy. Then, on a freezing Tuesday night in March 5 years ago, my phone rang. The caller ID said Aunt Sarah. I answered it, expecting small talk. "Joshua," Sarah said. Her voice was trembling, tight with panic. I didn't know who else to call. "I need to tell you something, and you can't tell your parents I told you." "What is it? Are they sick?" I asked, my heart rate spiking. "It's the house," Sarah said. "Your father's back has been acting up. He missed a lot of work over the winter. Joshua, they are 3 months behind on the mortgage. The bank just sent a final notice of foreclosure. If they don't catch up immediately, they are going to lose the house by the end of the summer." The words hit me like a physical weight. The house on Maple Drive was everything to my father. It was his pride. If he lost it, the shame would literally kill him. The thought of my parents packing up their lives in cardboard boxes, facing the pitying stares of Mrs. Patterson and the rest of the town, felt as heavy and devastating as planning a funeral. "Does Elijah know?" I asked, gripping the phone tightly. "He lives 20 minutes away." "Elijah knows," Sarah said bitterly. "He told them a month ago that he would handle it. He promised your dad he had the money. But Joshua, I checked the mail today when your mom was at work. I saw the final notice. Elijah hasn't paid a single dime. and your father is too proud to ever ask him about it. I hung up the phone and sat in the dark living room of my apartment for hours. Chloe came out of the bedroom, saw my face, and sat next to me. I explained everything. I told her about Elijah's empty promise, about the impending foreclosure, and about the sheer, terrifying reality that my parents were about to be homeless. The next morning, before the sun even came up, I made a decision. I called First National Bank in Hardin as soon as they opened. I asked to speak to the branch manager, a man named Dave Keller. Mr. Keller, my name is Joshua Mitchell. My parents, Robert and Eleanor Mitchell, hold a mortgage with your branch, I said. Dave was professional but guarded. I can't discuss account specifics without their authorization, Mr. Mitchell. I don't need to discuss specifics, I interrupted. I know they are 3 months behind and facing foreclosure. I want to pay the arrears today in full, and I want to set up an automatic wire transfer from my account in Denver to cover their exact mortgage payment every single month until the house is completely paid off. There was a long silence on the line. I heard Dave typing on his keyboard. Mr. Mitchell, that is a very significant financial commitment. Furthermore, someone else called this branch 2 weeks ago, claiming to be a family member, and said they were going to settle the account. They never followed through. That was my brother, Elijah, I said coldly. Ignore him. He's not going to pay it. But I have one absolute, non-negotiable condition, Dave. This has to be completely anonymous. You cannot tell my parents the money is coming from me. You cannot tell my brother. If anyone asks, you tell them the payments are being made by an anonymous benefactor through a trust. Understood? Dave sighed. I can set it up that way. But you understand you won't get any credit for this, right? I don't want credit, I said. I want them to keep their home. The monthly payment was exactly $2,300. That is a massive amount of money to lose from your budget overnight. When I told Chloe what I had done, I braced myself for an argument. I expected her to yell, to tell me I was insane for sacrificing our future for a family that treated me like garbage. Instead, Chloe walked over to the kitchen table, pulled out her laptop, and opened our shared budget spreadsheet. She highlighted the row labeled Mexico Anniversary Trip and hit delete. Then she highlighted the row labeled Future College Fund and cut the monthly contribution down to 0. Okay, Chloe said, looking up at me with eyes full of fierce determination. We eat at home from now on. We cancel the cable. We make this work. Because this is who you are, Joshua, and it's why I love you. For 2 years, we bled financially. Every single month, $2,300 vanished from my checking account. I drove my car until the tires were completely bald before replacing them. We shopped at discount grocery stores, clipping coupons like our lives depended on it. But every month, I logged into the First National Bank portal and watched the principal balance on my parents' mortgage drop lower and lower. The foreclosure notices stopped. The house was saved. My parents never called to say thank you, because they didn't know it was me. I found peace in the silence. Until Thanksgiving 2 years later. Aunt Sarah called me the day after Thanksgiving. I answered the phone, expecting to hear about the turkey or how the cousins were doing. Instead, Sarah's voice was shaking with pure, unadulterated rage. Joshua, you need to sit down, she said. What happened? Is Dad okay? I asked. Physically, he's fine. Morally, this family is bankrupt, Sarah spat. Elijah stood up in the middle of Thanksgiving dinner yesterday. He tapped his glass with a fork to get everyone's attention. And then, he looked right at your father and announced that he had been secretly paying the mortgage for the last 2 years to save the house. My brain short-circuited. He what? He lied, Joshua. He took the credit. He told everyone that his business was doing great and he wanted to give back to the family. Your father literally cried. He stood up, hugged Elijah in front of 40 people, and called him the savior of the family. He said Elijah was the only son who actually cared about his flesh and blood. I felt the blood drain from my face. My hands started to tremble. I was sacrificing my own future, my own peace of mind, scraping by month to month, and my brother was wearing my sacrifice like a crown. It gets worse, Sarah said, her voice dropping to an angry whisper. Because your parents think they don't have a mortgage anymore, they have extra money every month. Elijah convinced Dad to hire a lawyer to discuss estate planning and his future inheritance. He convinced Dad to put his name on all their bank accounts to help manage their finances. And Joshua, Elijah just bought a brand new, jet black Porsche. He showed up to dinner in it. He told everyone it was a reward for his hard work. He's using their money, Joshua. He's draining them while you pay for their roof. I gripped the edge of the kitchen counter so hard my knuckles popped. I wanted to scream. I wanted to buy a plane ticket, fly to Ohio, drag Elijah out of that Porsche by his expensive collar, and beat the truth out of him in the middle of Maple Drive. I wanted to call my father and send him the bank statements right then and there. Tell them, Sarah pleaded. Let me tell them, Joshua. I will ruin him. I closed my eyes. I pictured my father's face if he found out his golden boy was a con artist. It would break him. It would destroy the family entirely. And worse, if Dad's pride was wounded, he might refuse to let the bank accept my money anymore out of sheer stubbornness. The house would go right back into foreclosure. No, I said, my voice cracking. Don't say a word, Sarah. Joshua, you cannot let him get away with this. As long as the house is safe, it doesn't matter who gets the credit. I lied. I hung up the phone, slid down the kitchen cabinets, and sat on the linoleum floor with my head in my hands. For 3 more years, I endured it. I paid the $2,300 every single month. I watched from afar, through Sarah's furious updates, as Elijah cemented his role as the wealthy, benevolent patriarch of the family. He threw lavish parties at my parents' house. He dictated who was invited to holidays and who wasn't, and I was never invited. Finally, 5 years and 60 payments later, the balance hit zero. The final transfer cleared. Total amount paid, $137,412. The house belonged entirely to Robert and Eleanor Mitchell. I felt a massive weight lift off my shoulders. I took Chloe out to the nicest steakhouse in Denver to celebrate. I thought the nightmare was finally over. I thought I could just walk away and live my life in peace. 2 weeks later, I opened Facebook. Right at the top of my feed was a post from Elijah. It was a digital invitation, complete with a professional graphic design. Celebrating 40 years of true love. Join us for Mom and Dad's 40th anniversary party. Hosted by Elijah Mitchell. Family only. The post had hundreds of likes. Uncle Ray commented, "Can't wait to celebrate the best couple I know." Cousin Bobby commented, "Bringing the good whiskey for this one." I scrolled through the comments. Not a single mention of me. Not a single message in my inbox. They were throwing a massive party under the roof that I had spent the last 5 years of my life bleeding to pay for, and they didn't even have the decency to invite me. Something inside me finally snapped. The quiet, compliant, invisible Joshua died right there on the couch. I picked up my phone and dialed Elijah's number. "Yeah," he answered, sounding distracted. "Elijah, it's Joshua. I saw the Facebook post about the anniversary party. When does it start? I need to know when to book my flight." The silence on the line was deafening. I could practically hear his brain scrambling to find a lie. Listen, man," Elijah stammered, his voice dropping into that fake, patronizing tone. "I didn't think you'd want to come. You hate flying, right?" "I don't hate flying. What time is the party?" Elijah sighed heavily. "Look, Joshua, Dad specifically asked me not to invite you. He said he doesn't want any drama or awkwardness ruining their special day. You know how he feels about you leaving." "Really?" I said, my voice cold as ice. "Dad said that? Or did you decide that for him to protect your own image?" "I am protecting this family," Elijah snapped, his facade cracking. "You haven't been around in years. You don't get to just waltz back in here and make Mom and Dad uncomfortable. Stay in Denver, Joshua. Stay away." "I'll be there," I said and hung up. I immediately called Dave Keller at First National Bank. "Dave, the account is settled. I said. I need you to overnight me the official, notarized mortgage satisfaction certificate with the bank's gold seal on it. And I need a printed ledger of all 60 payments. I want my name, my routing number, and the exact dates clearly visible on every single page. I'll have it sent via overnight courier today, Mr. Mitchell, Dave said. When the thick manila envelope arrived, I sat at my dining room table. I pulled out the crisp official documents, 60 pages proving exactly who saved that family. Then I took out a pen and wrote a letter to my parents. Took me 4 drafts. I tore up the first 3 because they were too angry, too bitter. The final draft was simple, honest, and devastating. I placed the letter on top of the bank statements, put them in a sturdy box, and wrapped it in gold paper. The next morning, Chloe drove me to the airport. As I grabbed my bag, she pulled me into a tight hug. You survived 5 years of being the bigger person, she whispered in my ear. Today, you let the truth do the talking. I love you. I boarded the plane with the gold box on my lap, ready to drop a bomb on the fiction my brother had built. I was already 5 miles down the interstate, gripping the steering wheel of my rental car so hard my hands were cramping, when the bomb finally went off back at the house on Maple Drive. I didn't get to see the explosion with my own eyes. I didn't get to watch the shockwave roll through that crowded living room. But Aunt Sarah called me the very next morning. She gave me a play-by-play that was so vivid, so brutally detailed, that I feel like I was standing right there in the corner watching the whole thing unfold. The moment the heavy wooden front door clicked shut behind me, the suffocating silence in that room shattered. Elijah, always the showman, immediately tried to seize control of the narrative. He clapped his hands together, plastered his trademark charismatic smile onto his face, and let out a loud, forced laugh. Well, that was incredibly awkward, Elijah announced to the crowd, shaking his head like he was the victim of a terrible inconvenience. I apologize for my brother's little dramatic exit. He's always had a chip on his shoulder. But let's not let his tantrum ruin Mom and Dad's special night. Who wants to cut this massive cake? A few people murmured politely. Cousin Bobby shifted his weight from one foot to the other, looking uncomfortable. Nobody made a single move toward the dessert table. Aunt Sarah didn't move either. She stood perfectly still near the entryway, holding my torn gold box in both of her hands. She told me later that she felt like she was holding a live hand grenade, and she was just waiting for the absolute perfect second to pull the pin. She looked at Elijah, who was sweating through his expensive navy suit. Then she looked at my father, who was still red-faced, breathing heavily, staring blankly at the spot on the hardwood floor where he had shoved my gift. Sarah took a deep breath, squared her shoulders, and walked slowly to the center of the massive, L-shaped arrangement of folding tables. Every single eye in the room followed her. Before anyone touches a single slice of that cake, Sarah said. Her voice wasn't a yell, but it was so sharp and commanding that it cut through the lingering tension like a steel blade. There is something every single person in this room needs to see right now. Dad's head snapped up. His eyes narrowed. Sarah, leave it alone. Put that trash in the garbage can and stay out of family business. I have stayed out of it for 5 long years, Robert. Sarah shot back, her voice rising in volume. I have bit my tongue until it bled. That ends right now. Elijah realized what was happening. He moved fast. He lunged toward her, reaching his hand out to snatch the box. Aunt Sarah, come on. This isn't the time or the place for this. Give me the box. Let me just throw it away outside. Don't you dare touch me, Elijah, Sarah warned. Her eyes flashed with a maternal fury that made Elijah physically recoil. He froze in his tracks, his hand suspended in midair. Sarah slammed the gold box down on the exact same spot on the white tablecloth where Dad had pushed it off 2 minutes earlier. She didn't bother trying to save the wrapping paper. She dug her fingers in and ripped the rest of the gold foil away, tossing it onto the floor. She exposed the thick, heavy manila envelope bearing the First National Bank logo. She pulled out my handwritten letter and set it aside for a moment. Then, she reached into the envelope and pulled out the crisp, official certificate of mortgage satisfaction. She deliberately reached into her purse, pulled out her reading glasses, and slid them onto her nose. She took her time. She wanted them to sweat. "Let's see what cheap garbage Joshua flew 3,000 miles to bring you," Sarah said loudly, making sure her voice carried to the folks standing by the kitchen. She held the certificate up high so the people in the front row could clearly see the heavy, embossed gold bank seal catching the light. Then, she read the document out loud. "Official Certificate of Mortgage Satisfaction for the property located at 1427 Maple Drive, Hardin, Ohio. Paid in full and closed as of September 14th. She paused, lowering the paper just enough to look directly into my father's eyes. "Total amount paid to prevent bank foreclosure, $137,412. The room went completely, terrifyingly still. It was the kind of absolute quiet you only experience at a funeral. Dad's jaw physically dropped. He looked at the piece of paper in Sarah's hand. Then he looked at Elijah and then back to Sarah. "What on earth are you talking about?" Dad demanded, his voice trembling with confusion. "Elijah paid that off. Elijah saved this house. He told us." "Did he?" Sarah challenged. She reached back into the manila envelope and pulled out the massive, thick stack of bank statements. 60 separate pages. She slammed the entire stack onto the table with a loud smack. "These are the certified transaction records from the bank. Direct wire transfers coming from a checking account in Denver, Colorado. Exactly $2,300 every single month for 60 consecutive months." She picked up the top 5 pages of the ledger, marched over to my father, and shoved them aggressively against his chest. He fumbled and grabbed them. His large, calloused hands began to shake violently. "Look at the name on the account, Robert," Sarah commanded, pointing a rigid finger at the paper. "Read it." Dad stared at the top sheet. His lips moved soundlessly as he read the bold print. "Joshua Mitchell." He flipped to the second page. "Joshua Mitchell." He flipped to the third. "Joshua Mitchell." Over and over again. Line by line. Month by month. Year by year. The undeniable proof of my existence, and my sacrifice, was staring him right in the face. Sarah turned away from him and faced the rest of the crowded room. She started peeling off pages of the bank statements and handing them out to anyone who was standing close enough to take one. She handed a page to Uncle Ray. She thrust a page into Cousin Bobby's hands. She even handed a page to Mrs. Patterson, who grabbed it like it was the winning lottery ticket. 5 years, Sarah announced to the room, making sure every single person heard the truth. Joshua lived in a tiny apartment. He canceled his vacations. He drained his own salary. He completely emptied out his future college fund to quietly pay the crushing debt on this house. He did it so his father wouldn't lose his pride. He did it completely anonymously, asking for absolutely nothing in return. Uncle Ray slowly looked up from the bank ledger in his hands. His face was dark with anger. He turned slowly and looked straight at Elijah. "Elijah," Ray said, his voice thick with a dangerous, quiet rage. "You looked me dead in the eye at the Thanksgiving dinner table 2 years ago, and you swore to me you were writing checks to the bank." Elijah's face was entirely drained of color. He looked like a cornered animal. He took a clumsy step backward, bumping his hip hard against a metal folding chair. I helped," he stammered, his silver tongue finally failing him. "I contributed in other ways, Uncle Ray. I handled the lawyer stuff. I managed the inheritance planning to protect the family assets. I gave them financial advice. You didn't pay a single dime toward the roof over your own parents' heads," Sarah yelled, her voice echoing off the walls. "Dave Keller at the branch confirmed it all to me. You promised your father you would pay the arrears, and then you walked away and let them face foreclosure. Joshua stepped in from 3,000 miles away to save them from being thrown out onto the street." Dad slowly lowered the papers. The anger was completely gone from his face, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated devastation. It was the look of an old man watching the entire foundation of his reality crumble into dust. "You lied to me," Dad whispered, his voice cracking. You let me stand up in front of this entire family and call you a savior. You sat there and smiled while I treated your brother like absolute dirt. You let me throw his gift on the floor. Elijah opened his mouth, desperately trying to form a sentence, but nothing came out. He looked around the room, searching for a single friendly face. The neighbors and cousins who had been clapping for his champagne toast 10 minutes ago were now glaring at him with pure disgust. Mrs. Patterson actually took a physical step away from him, pulling her cardigan tight around her shoulders. Cousin Bobby shook his head in absolute disbelief. Then Mr. Holloway spoke up. He is our 70-year-old neighbor, a retired mechanic who has lived across the street since before I was even born. He leaned heavily on his wooden cane, stepping out from the crowd, and looked directly at my father. Robert, Mr. Holloway said, his voice gravelly and slow, carrying the weight of decades of observation. You just threw out the only son who actually gave a damn about you. The moment Mr. Holloway spoke those words, whatever fight was left in Elijah completely evaporated. He couldn't handle the heavy, judgmental stares of 60 people. He couldn't handle the reality of being publicly exposed as a fraud. Without saying another word to Mom, without offering a single apology to Dad, Elijah grabbed his car keys off the side table, shoved his way roughly through the crowd, and bolted out the back door. Seconds later, everyone in the living room heard the aggressive, roaring engine of his precious black Porsche fire up. We heard the tires violently squeal against the asphalt as he sped away from the house, fleeing the scene of his own crime. He didn't stay to face the music. He just ran like a coward. Inside the house, the anniversary party was completely dead. The celebratory atmosphere had been sucked out of the room, replaced by a heavy, suffocating blanket of grief and embarrassment. Guests began gathering their coats, purses, and covered dishes in awkward, hushed silence. Nobody wanted to make eye contact with Dad. They murmured quiet, uncomfortable apologies to Mom, avoiding looking at the bank statements scattered across the tables, and quickly shuffled out the front door. Within 20 minutes, a house that had been packed with 60 laughing, celebrating people was entirely empty, save for Mom, Dad, Aunt Sarah, and Uncle Ray. The silence in the room was deafening. The festive country music had been turned off. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Mom was sitting collapsed in her metal folding chair. She had her face buried deep in her hands, her shoulders shaking as she sobbed uncontrollably. Dad was frozen perfectly in place, standing over the table, staring blankly down at the torn gold wrapping paper resting on the hardwood floor. Uncle Ray, who is a no-nonsense construction foreman and doesn't sugarcoat anything for anybody, walked slowly over to Dad. He put a heavy hand on Dad's shoulder. Robert, Ray said firmly, forcing Dad to look up. If Elijah lied to your face about paying off the house for 5 solid years, what else has that boy been lying to you about? Dad blinked, snapping out of his miserable trance. He looked at Ray, his eyes bloodshot. What do you mean, Ray? The lawyer, Ray said, crossing his arms. The fancy estate planning he insisted on. The joint bank accounts. You gave him full, unrestricted access to all your finances because you honestly believed he was saving your neck from the bank. Where is your money actually going, Robert? Dad's face went from pale to a sickly ash gray. Panic flooded his eyes. He stumbled away from the table, practically running over to the old, heavy oak desk in the corner of the living room. He unlocked the bottom drawer with shaking hands and pulled out a thick, overstuffed stack of financial folders that Elijah had generously organized for them. Ray stood right over his shoulder, acting as a witness, as they frantically dug through the piles of paper. Took them less than 10 minutes to find the smoking gun. It was a standard auto loan agreement for a luxury vehicle. Specifically, the brand-new jet-black Porsche that Elijah had been parading around town for the last 2 years. Elijah didn't buy that car with the profits from his supposedly booming business. He didn't have a successful business at all. He bought that exorbitant car by taking out a massive, high-interest loan and tying it directly to my parents' joint savings account. because my parents believed they didn't have a monthly mortgage payment anymore. They had been faithfully building up a decent retirement savings over the last 5 years. Elijah, acting as their financial manager, had been slowly, methodically bleeding that savings account dry to pay for his luxury car loan, his tailored suits, and his lavish dinners out. He had literally stolen their financial security, their hard-earned safety net, to fund his fake, arrogant lifestyle. Dad let out a sound that was half gasp, half sob. He collapsed backward into his worn armchair. The loan documents slipped out of his trembling hands and scattered like dead leaves across the floor. He put his head between his knees and wept. Aunt Sarah told me later that it was a genuinely terrifying sound. My father was a hard, incredibly proud, stubborn man. Hearing him break down and cry like a wounded animal was something nobody in the family had ever witnessed in his entire 64 years of life. "I pushed him away," Dad kept repeating, his voice choked with heavy sobs, rocking back and forth. "I pushed my own son's gift off the table. I called him a stranger to his face." Mom suddenly stopped crying. She stood up from her folding chair. She wiped her wet face with her hands, smearing her makeup. She walked over to the main table, gently picked up my handwritten letter that Sarah had set aside, and held it tightly against her chest. She looked down at Dad with a fierce, uncompromising expression. "Call him," she demanded. Dad fumbled in his pocket, pulled out his cell phone, and dialed my number. I was sitting alone in the crowded airport terminal in Columbus, staring blankly at the departure board, waiting for my late-night flight back to Denver. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out and looked at the screen. The caller ID said, "Dad." I stared at that glowing name for a long time. My thumb hovered over the green accept button. Then, I slowly moved my thumb and hit the red ignore button. He called again. I ignored it again. He called 5 times, 10 times in a row. I let every single one of those calls go straight to voicemail. I was too emotionally exhausted, too thoroughly drained, to listen to whatever frantic excuses or apologies he was trying to stitch together. I boarded my plane, switched my phone to airplane mode, closed the window shade, and flew home in absolute darkness. Back in Ohio, Dad set his phone down on the oak desk. He looked up at Mom, his eyes hollow. "He won't answer the phone." Mom didn't hesitate for a single second. "Then go get the keys to the truck, Robert. We are driving to Denver right now." "Judy, be reasonable, it's a 14-hour drive," Dad protested weakly, sounding totally defeated. "It's the middle of the night. We're exhausted." "I don't care if it takes us 14 years to get there," Mom said, her voice harder and more resolute than it had ever been in their entire marriage. "We are going to our son's house, and we are not leaving his front porch until he comes out and looks us in the eye. Go get the keys." At 3 o'clock in the morning, Dad backed his dusty, 10-year-old white pickup truck out of the driveway. Mom climbed into the passenger seat holding a large thermos of black coffee and the gold box, which Sarah had carefully taped back together. They pulled out of the neighborhood, merged onto the dark interstate, and drove west. They didn't stop to rest at a hotel. They only stopped for gas and bathroom breaks. They drove silently across the flat plains of Ohio, through the endless cornfields of Indiana and Illinois, across the bridge into Iowa, over the sprawling stretches of Nebraska, and straight into the rising altitude of Colorado. It was 14 grueling, back-breaking hours of highway lines, burnt coffee, and suffocating, overwhelming guilt. I woke up the next morning in Denver feeling incredibly strange. For the first time in 5 years, my chest didn't feel tight. The massive, ugly secret was finally out in the open. The heavy burden of carrying my family's financial survival in absolute silence was gone. I walked into my kitchen, made a fresh pot of coffee, poured a steaming mug for myself, and walked out onto my front porch. I sat down on the cold wooden steps in my bathrobe, feeling the crisp, sharp mountain air against my face. Chloe was still fast asleep inside the house. The neighborhood was perfectly quiet, the sun just barely peeking over the horizon, painting the sky in shades of pale pink and orange. At exactly 7:15 a.m., the quiet of the morning was broken. A large vehicle turned the corner and slowly drove down my residential street. It was a truck, covered in a thick, gray layer of highway grime, with countless bugs splattered across the front grille and windshield. I recognized the Ohio license plates instantly. The truck pulled over and parked haphazardly against my curb, the tires scraping the concrete. The engine ticked loudly as it cooled down in the morning air. The driver's side door creaked open, and my father stepped out. He looked absolutely terrible. He was wearing the exact same flannel shirt he had worn to the anniversary party the night before, now heavily wrinkled and stained with spilled coffee. His eyes were deeply bloodshot, rimmed with dark, heavy purple circles. His hair was a mess. The 14-hour drive had taken a brutal toll on him. He looked like he had aged a full decade overnight. Mom stepped out of the passenger side a moment later. She looked just as exhausted, clutching the taped-up gold box tightly against her chest like it was a shield. They walked slowly up my concrete driveway and stopped right at the bottom of the porch steps. 20 feet of space separated us. I didn't stand up. I didn't run down the stairs to embrace them. I just sat there, holding my warm coffee mug in both hands, and waited for them to speak. Dad took off his faded baseball cap and crushed it nervously in his hands. His jaw worked back and forth. He looked at me, really looked at my face, for what felt like the very first time in years. "Joshua," he said. His voice was completely stripped raw, raspy from exhaustion and crying. "I am so sorry. I didn't say anything. I just looked at him, letting the weight of those 3 words hang in the cold morning air. I was blind," Dad continued, tears welling up in his exhausted, red eyes and spilling over his cheeks. "I let my own stupid, stubborn pride blind me to the truth. I pushed away the only person in the world who was actually holding this family up. I let Elijah play me for an absolute fool, and I took all my anger and resentment out on you. You saved our home. You saved my life. And I insulted you in front of the whole town. I threw your gift on the floor like garbage. I don't expect you to forgive me, Joshua. I really don't. I just needed to drive here, look you in the face, and tell you I was wrong." He stood there at the bottom of the stairs, a broken, humbled man, waiting for a verdict he felt he didn't deserve. Before I could formulate a response, Mom walked up the first wooden step. Her face was streaked with dried tears, her posture slumped. "Joshua, there's something else," Mom said, her voice shaking violently. "Something you need to know. And it's the reason I haven't been able to sleep for years." She took a deep, shuddering breath, clutching the gold box tighter. I knew. I frowned, my brow furrowing in deep confusion. "You knew what?" "I knew Elijah wasn't paying the mortgage," she confessed. The words tumbled out of her mouth like a heavy, poisonous confession she couldn't hold inside anymore. "Around year 3, I was looking for a meatloaf recipe in the bottom desk drawer. I found a letter from the bank that Elijah had accidentally left out. It showed the routing number of the person making the monthly wire transfers. It wasn't Elijah's local bank. And I knew Elijah was always broke, always asking your father for short-term loans. Deep down, Joshua, I knew it had to be you. You were the only one with a steady job in a big city. You were the only one responsible enough to actually do it." I stared at her, my heart suddenly hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "You knew for 2 years? You knew I was paying it and you let Dad give Elijah all the credit? You sat there and let Dad say those horrible things to me, year after year." Mom broke down sobbing. She dropped to her knees right there on the hard concrete step. "I was terrified, Joshua. I was so scared. Your father was finally happy. He was so proud of Elijah. If I told him the truth, if I exposed his golden boy as a liar and a thief, the shock would have destroyed him. It would have caused a massive fight. I was terrified he would ask for a divorce. I was terrified of tearing the whole family apart. I chose to keep the peace. I chose the easy way out. And by doing that, I betrayed my own son. I let you suffer in silence. And I will never, ever forgive myself." That was the final, brutal twist of the knife. The silence I had endured from my family wasn't just born of ignorance. It was active, calculated complicity. My own mother knew I was bleeding myself dry for them, sacrificing my salary and my future, and she deliberately chose to protect a comfortable lie rather than stand up for me. I slowly stood up. I set my coffee mug down on the wooden railing. I looked down at both of them. "Your silence was a choice, Mom," I said, my voice eerily calm, devoid of any shouting. "Your silence was a betrayal. You protected a fake family peace at the cost of my sanity. You let me believe I was worthless. And Dad, you chose to believe a ridiculous lie because it perfectly fit the narrative you always wanted. That Elijah was the ultimate winner, and I was the disappointment." Dad nodded, tears streaming down his face, accepting every single word. He didn't offer a single excuse. "But," I continued, taking one step down the stairs toward them, "you drove 14 grueling hours through the night to stand on my porch, look me in the eye, and admit all of it. That tells me there is a tiny shred of respect left to salvage." I laid out my terms right then and there. I was uncompromising. I told them I loved them, but the dynamic of our relationship was going to change permanently. I was no longer the invisible son. I was no longer the emotional punching bag. I told them that Elijah was strictly, permanently cut out of my life. If they ever tried to mention his name to me, or if they ever tried to mediate a forced reconciliation between us, I would change my phone number, move, and walk away from them forever. I told them they needed to prove they actually wanted to be in my life through consistent actions, not just empty, tearful apologies. They agreed to absolutely everything. They promised they would do whatever it took. They walked into my house, sat down at my cheap kitchen table. Chloe made them breakfast, and for the first time in my 31 years of life, we actually sat down and talked to each other with genuine honesty. It has been exactly 3 months since that cold morning on my porch in Denver. Back in Hardin, Ohio, the social fallout was absolute and merciless. You know how small towns operate. Word spread faster than a wildfire in dry brush. By Monday morning following the anniversary party, everyone at the grocery store, the local diner, and the church knew exactly what Elijah had done. He became an instant, undeniable pariah. People stopped returning his phone calls. The friends who used to drink his expensive whiskey suddenly didn't want to be seen standing next to him. Without access to my parents' bank accounts to siphon off their savings, Elijah couldn't make the massive monthly payments on his fake luxury lifestyle. The bank repossessed the black Porsche right out of his driveway in broad daylight. Mrs. Patterson, naturally, watched the entire tow truck operation gleefully from her front window. Last I heard through the grapevine, Elijah packed up his apartment in the middle of the night and moved to a different state to avoid the crushing shame and the aggressive debt collectors chasing him. I haven't spoken a single word to him, and I never will. Dad went straight to First National Bank the very next week with Uncle Ray. They sat down with Dave Keller, immediately removed Elijah's name from every single account, and securely locked down their finances. Dad called me from the bank parking lot afterward to tell me it was officially done. My parents call me every single Sunday evening now. At 7 p.m. without fail, my phone rings. Dad is always the one who talks first. He asks about my latest projects at the architecture firm. He asks how Chloe is doing. Sometimes we only talk for 10 minutes about the weather or a sports game, but the point is, he calls. Mom sends handwritten cards in the mail every few weeks just to say hello. They are trying. They are really, truly putting in the effort to rebuild the trust they spent a lifetime breaking. Last month, Chloe and I finally got married. We had a small, intimate ceremony up in the beautiful Colorado mountains. We used the money we had finally started saving up again to pay for it ourselves. My parents flew out for the wedding. It was the first time Dad had been on a commercial airplane in his entire life. When I walked down the aisle, I looked at the front row. Dad was sitting there, wearing a simple, clean suit, holding Mom's hand tightly. He wasn't the loudest guy in the room anymore. He was quiet, humble, and when I looked at him, he smiled and gave me a small, deeply respectful nod. I didn't buy my parents' love with that house. I forced them to open their eyes and finally see me. Sometimes you have to stop screaming for attention and let your actions speak loud enough to shatter the comfortable illusions people build around you. Thank you for sticking around and listening to my story. I know it was a long journey, but sharing it here feels like finally letting go of a massive breath I've been holding in my chest for 5 years. I hope this resonated with you in some way. Family dynamics are rarely simple, and sometimes the people who are supposed to protect us are the ones who hurt us the most. Have you ever found yourself in a similar situation? Have you ever had to carry a heavy burden for people who didn't even notice? Or had someone else completely steal the credit for your hard work? I would really love to read your stories down in the comments. Before you go, I have a special request for my true supporters. If you listened to every single word of this story and made it all the way to this exact moment, you are officially part of the 1% Club. I want you to go down to the comments right now and type the letter W. That stands for winner. That is our secret code, our signal so I can recognize the incredible people who stayed with me until the very end. Please don't forget to hit that like button and follow the channel so we can continue to share these journeys together. I have a lot more stories to tell, and I'd love for you to be there for them. Until next time, take care of yourselves, and remember to never let anyone make you feel invisible.